Hello and welcome to the Fuel Run Recover podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchuk, registered dietitian, running coach, marathon runner, and mom. This season, we're breaking down running's biggest trends, hot topics, and myths, and turning them into practical nutrition and training advice you can actually use every day. Let's get into it. Hey there. Before we get into this week's episode, I want to just take a minute to invite you to a free webinar that I'm hosting on Wednesday, May the 6th. It's my Fuel Smarter, Run Stronger webinar. If you are stuck in a running rut, if you are constantly battling food cravings, if you just cannot seem to get any changes on the scale or with your body composition, and you're tired of bonking on your long runs and raiding the kitchen every night like a hungry trash panda, then I really want you to save a spot and join me live for this workshop. In it, I'm going to share with you why most of the nutrition advice that you hear online is just wrong when it comes to runners. And honestly, why a lot of the nutrition advice that you hear from family, friends, or maybe even your doctor is not great advice if you're a runner. And I'll also be sharing with you the key strategies that you need to really level up your running performance, have better quality workouts, start getting closer to your PR goals, and most of all, stop constantly battling cravings and feel like food is just so complicated, so confusing, and so overwhelming. So once again, this is my Fuel Smarter, Run Stronger webinar. It's on May the 6th, and you can save your spot for this event at the link in the show notes. All right, hope to see you there. Welcome to this week's episode of the Fuel Run Recover podcast. I'm excited this week to talk about race week nutrition, the actual day of your race, what your nutrition should look like starting 7 days out until you get to the morning of your event. Now, I want to preface all of this by saying the number one thing I want you to remember and avoid doing during your urge to massively cut back on your food intake just because you're probably tapering during this time. So you're going to be not training as much. You're not going to be training at the same maybe frequency or volume. You're not going to be doing strength training or as much cross training that week. During your taper, please resist the urge to fill up your calendar with a bunch more cross training and other stuff just because you're not running. But during that time, this isn't the time for a dramatic cutback on food just because you're not running as much as you were during your peak volume weeks, right? Okay, the other thing that we want to make sure we do heading into this final week of is that all of these things that I'm talking about here are things that we have practiced in training, because I see this, all the time on social media. Somebody will say, hey, my race is coming up next week or in a couple of days. What should I be eating this week during race week? And so the specific foods that we're going to be consuming during this time are going to be the things that we've been eating in training. So there are no new foods. There are no new different strategies that you haven't practiced during your training cycle. So that's the most important thing. Start now. I don't care how far away your race is. If you are actively training for a race, it's never too early. There is no time that it's too early to be thinking about your nutrition. So when you're like 7 days out, you're going to have that last long run. Now, during a taper, depending on the length of your taper, this last long run is going to be probably shorter, maybe significantly shorter than the long runs that you were doing during your like peak volume weeks. But your final long run here might still be upwards of, 90 minutes, right? So this is kind of your like one last test run for the fuel and the fluids and the electrolytes and the things that you're going to be consuming during your carb load and during the run itself, even if the total amounts are actually a little bit lower. So, right, you're going to be treating it like a dress rehearsal for race day, but because the run is shorter, then you're not going to be taking like, say, as many gels or like as much of your carbohydrate drink mix kind of thing, because it's just a shorter run. You're just not out there for as long, so you don't need quite as much. But you really want this to be kind of like your last trial run, just to like lock everything in, make sure that you're writing down what you're doing as well. So like have somewhere that you're keeping a notebook, you're keeping track of, okay, this much of this much of that, this was the weather, this much fluid, right? Because again, the more things that are left to are things that aren't quite solidified that you have just like up in your head, but it's hard to remember all these details all the time. the more you're going to be uncertain for the actual race. Uncertainty leads to anxiety. And the last thing we want when we're lining up for a race is unnecessary anxiety, right? You're going to have a little bit of race day jitters, probably, right? You're going to have a little bit of anxiety just because you're about to run a race. We do not also want to have a bunch of unnecessary anxiety around when am I going to fuel? What am I fueling with? Should I be taking this gel first or drinking this first? What aid stations am I stopping at? Like all those things. Those are things that we should have locked in, ready to go. There is no question when we are there at the start line. We are making sure that we have all those details. We're ready to go for race day. When you're kind of in that like 4 to 6 days out range, right? So you're within that week of your race, you've done your final long run, you're well into your taper, but you kind of have that like a middle ground. Like you're going to have a couple of workouts in there, short little speed session, couple of easy runs, maybe some strides, that kind of thing in those final 4 to 6 days. And this is where we really want to just simply adapt our fueling for our training demands. The easiest way to do that is to use the athlete's plates. The athlete's plates are a very handy visual guide to adapting our portion sizes and our proportion of foods on our plates based on the training volume or intensity that we have planned for that day. So if you're resting or if you're running, these plates are your guide to making sure that you're fueling appropriately for the demands of that work. These athletes' plates are readily available online. If you Google the athletes' plates, you will find the website from the United States Olympic Committee Nutrition Department. And so that's where the athletes' plates originally come from. In my program, The Fueled Runner, we use the athletes' plates and I walk you through how to use them, how to incorporate them into your training based on your training demand, training cycle phase and all of that. So those are things that we cover inside my nutrition program, The Fueled Runner, as well as things that are covered inside the Fuel Train Recover Club, which is my nutrition and run coaching program. So anyway, the athletes' plates are kind of your go-to visual tool for this. If you are tracking calories, macros, that sort of thing, then yeah, of course, you don't need as much fuel as you were consuming during your peak volume weeks, but this isn't a time to cut back, right? This isn't a time to go into a big calorie deficit. We don't want to be eliminating carbs. We don't want to be avoiding anything, skipping meals, doing all kinds of wacky stuff with our eating, right? Like we just need to adjust and adapt for the realities of what we're doing for our volume, but not think that this is a time that we need to minimize our food intake. We don't need to do anything different yet. Stick to the foods that you've been eating in training and avoid underfueling during this time, right? You don't want to like go into your carb load completely depleted. Now, there's a couple of situations where you may want to start a carb load 4 days before your race. Now, typically a carb load is going to be between 1 and 3 days, depending on the distance you're racing and the duration of time that you're going to be running for. So the longer you're going to be running for, the longer that carb load should be. The longer the distance that you're racing, the longer the carb load should be. So somewhere between 1 and 3 days is typically what's recommended. Now, there are a few situations, though, where I think that starting your carb load 4 days out makes sense. And I'm going to outline those for you here. The first one is if you are signed up for a multi-day event where you're going to be running on consecutive days, and at least one of those is going to be a half or a full marathon distance. Now, that can either be in time or in distance, because if you're doing like a multi-day trail race kind of thing, you know, it might be only 15 kilometers that you're covering per day. But I mean, if it's a very technical trail run, that may be many hours of being out on the trail, in which case you are going to need like the time is what matters here, not the distance that you're covering on really technical terrain. So yeah, if you're doing a multi-day event that you're going to be digging into those muscle glycogen stores and using up some of those muscle glycogen stores as you go, right? You're not getting the full benefit of that carb load because you're also needing to use some energy. So starting a day early makes a lot of sense here. So especially if you're doing something like the Dopey Challenge, where you've got like the 5K, the 10K, the half, and the full, you're going to want to start that carb load like 4 days before the full, right? So you get an extra day of carb loading in there to account for the fact that you've got like a 10K and a half. A 5K, you're not burning through that much muscle glycogen in a 5K. Same thing if you're signed up for like a 5K and a half or a 5K and a full. Um, a shakeout run, you're doing like a short group shakeout run kind of thing. We obviously don't need to carb load in advance for that, but it's the other ones, especially the 10K. And so we want to account for that as part of our carb loading plan so we don't get to that marathon day and we're already exhausted, right? We're already under recovered. We are sore, we're tired, and we have a really tough, crappy marathon because we just didn't fuel appropriately for the demands of what we've signed up for. Yeah, so if you're doing a multi-day event and at least one of those is going to be a half or a full marathon, I would start the carb load a day in advance. And then the other time is if you're traveling for a race. And when you're traveling for a race, the logistics of your travel schedule are very important because you might be traveling to a race where you are flying or driving to a destination days in advance. You're staying at an Airbnb, you are cooking your meals, you're going to the grocery, very much like home, right? Where you're in complete control of your food and the cooking and all of the things. And, the carb load is relatively seamless for that reason. But you might be traveling to an event where you're flying, and maybe you're flying somewhere on a Friday. The race is on Sunday. And so, like, right in the midst of your carb load, you have air travel. And air travel is just very inconvenient, right? It's hard to have enough fluids when you can't bring certain things into security, and if there's delays, and meal times can be weird, and it's just all over the map, right? And then if you find yourself, you're in a new city, you're staying at a hotel, eating in restaurants, and again, like, things are just not as within your realm of control. In those cases, starting your carb load one day earlier can also be really beneficial, because what that means is that now there is a little bit of wiggle room and a little bit less pressure to execute a perfect carb load when you're not in control of your environment or the situation. Like when I ran the New York City Marathon back in November of this past year, some of the runners that we knew from our city, they were on a different flight. We actually got like surprisingly lucky with our flights only being delayed a little bit, but some other people got delayed by like over 24 hours. So you're spending an extra 24 hours like sitting in an airport. And there's lots of candy and high carb snacks and things that you can get in an airport, but like not ideal, right? And if you want a meal, there might only be certain things open at certain times, only certain options for things. And so starting your carb load a day earlier just means less stress and anxiety. Because again, the last thing we need is more stress and anxiety heading into race day. Yeah, so if you're traveling and it just makes more sense logistically, timing your carb load a little bit early to account for that just makes it so much easier, so that again, if things go awry, or if you're traveling, I've got a client, Stephanie, who is going to be running the London Marathon in a couple of weeks, and she's traveling with family. And so, for her during her carb load, one of the things that we've been talking about is not wanting to have like the whole group sort of trip really centered and focused around like the restaurants that she needs to eat at and like the things that she needs to do. So starting the carb load a little bit early and having a strategy that makes it easier to still hit your target, but while being flexible with meals, is also something to consider. So really looking at that when you're traveling, how can I make this doable but simple so that it isn't like taking away from your enjoyment of the overall experience? Another final situation where you might want to carb load early is if you have a pretty sensitive gut and you want a little bit of time to let your system sort of settle and reset between starting a day early. Then the day before the race, you're going to go back to what your normal carb intake might be. So again, we're not cutting down. We're not going like minimal. We're just going back to like the normal amount that they will be eating on a day-to-day basis. I've had a few clients who have incorporated this strategy, and it does seem to work well. And it's even worth a try. Like, it's worth a try if you've even done, I'll say, sort of a good, proper carb loading strategy practiced it in training, you've done low fiber, you focus fluids, and you still just find that you just are really getting the carb load to a day earlier, and having that day to just like let everything settle, I think is also beneficial or can be beneficial. So there's a couple situations where we might want to start looking at a carb load 4 days out. Otherwise, though, carb loading for a full marathon is typically going to start 3 days out. If you are a very speedy marathoner, then yes, you can definitely do a 2 day, but I think 3 days is great. Most runners are going to benefit from a 3 day carb load for a marathon, right? Because if you're running faster and harder, you're burning more carbs per hour of running. If you're running slower, you're burning fewer carbs per hour, but you're out there for more hours. So to me, I know we can debate the ins and outs and sort of the details of, VO2 max and what percentage VO2 max and how much fuel is coming from fat versus carbs and all the ins and outs of that stuff. But I see it fairly straightforwardly, right? If you're running faster, you are burning more carb for a shorter period of time, but more carb in that period of time. If you're running slower, but for longer, you're running for longer. So I don't know. I don't know if it all ends up being the same either way. We're comparing apples and oranges, right? Two completely different runners doing completely different things with different amounts of training. So that sounds like a conversation maybe for another day, but that's the way that I see it. Now, here is where I mentioned before, it becomes really, really important to have practiced all of this in training, right? We are not getting to 3 days before a marathon where we have never carb loaded before. And now we're going to be like, okay, what do I do to carb load? No, right? This is something that we want to have planned and practiced and ready to go weeks and weeks and weeks in advance. Something that we are incorporating slowly over time into our whole training strategy, right? When you're 8 weeks out, when you're 12 weeks out from your marathon, we are starting to plant the seeds of carb loading, of practicing, of training our gut, so that none of this is a shock to our system or some kind of crazy logistical nightmare when we actually get down to it, right? The last thing I want for you is to be 3 days before a race, you're traveling, you're looking what you need to eat, and you're like, I can't do this. Now we're stressed, we're anxious, we have a bad race, we're underfueled because we just didn't plan or prepare well enough in advance. It's the last thing that I want for any runner, right? So we should know well in advance what is our total carb target for the day. It's going to be somewhere between 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of your body weight. We want fat and fiber to be very low. For fat, minimal fat. Like anywhere that we can get fat down lower is good, right? Because we don't want that interfering with our ability to take in enough carbohydrate. Fat keeps us full. Fat slows down our digestion. We don't want it during a carb load. Fiber, if you're used to eating a certain amount of fiber, let's say you're typically pretty good at hitting your target, the 25 to 38 grams of fiber per day between men and women. If you're sticking to around that amount while jacking up your carbs, I think we're in pretty good shape. Typically, we don't need to bring fiber way lower. We just don't want fiber to go up at the same rate that we're increasing our carbs. Because if you basically 3 to 4 times your carb intake, we don't want to 3 to 4 times our fiber intake along with it, because that's going to be problematic. Instead, we want to keep fiber to about the same as where we normally get and just jack up the carbs. Okay. So we're planning all this in advance. We're taking that total carb goal for the day and we're breaking that down into morning, afternoon, and evening. And we're aiming to hit our target for each block of time, spacing it out. The biggest mistake I see with runners hitting their daily carb loading target is they are missing the mark. They're not keeping track for the day. So you're eating kind of maybe a little bit extra in the morning, maybe a little bit extra at lunch, get to the end of the day and you're like, holy moly, I have to eat 600 grams of carbs at dinner. How am I going to do that? Right? Well, you're not. It's not the goal. We should have been fueling up better and carb loading more strategically earlier in the day. So by the time you get to the evening, your goal for the entire evening, right, dinner and a snack or something in the evening time is maybe 200 to at the most 350, right?
we're breaking it down and we're hitting our target for the day. Because if we're trying to cram everything in at night, then of course we're going to be too full and have gut issues, right? Like of course we are, because we can only handle so much food in our stomach all at once. Now, by the time we get to this point, 3 days before our race, we realistically want to have at least 3 solid carb loads under our belt at this point, so it's routine. There's no second guessing, there's no question, there's no anything. Going into this, we know exactly what we're going to do. We have it written down, we've got a target. One of the resources that I have inside my new Field Runner program is carb loading sample days. So what I've done is I've, calculated and drawn out if your carb loading target is 650 grams a day or 800 grams a day or 1,000 grams a day, what could you eat in that day, in the morning, in the time that I like, and what would those foods and those portions and those beverages look like to help you reach that target. So if you're looking for help like that with planning your fueling and practicing your fueling, that is one of the many things that you're going to find inside the Fueled Runner program. You can get more information about that at the link in the show notes. Okay. So 2 days out is when we want to for sure be carb loading for a marathon. This is also where I would recommend carb loading for a half marathon. Again, stick to what you know and what you've been practicing, right? We have enough on our mind 2 days before our big race. Nutrition should just feel very easy and very routine, right? We're not incorporating any new foods. We are not incorporating any new strategies. We are not shaking things up at this point. Again, especially if you're traveling, by now you might already be in a different city. That's stressful enough. You might be traveling, you're driving for maybe hours and hours. So we want to keep the nutrition very simple, right? We do not want more anxiety or stress than necessary. 1 day out, the day before your race, your carb load ideally will be in full swing. Unless you're traveling or trying this sort of gut rest approach, again, we're keeping the fat and fiber low, we're getting plenty of carbs from fluid, and we're spacing out our intake during the day. So those carb loading days are going to be very much rinse and repeat, again, except for some logistical stuff around traveling. For example, when I was running the New York Marathon last fall, I knew that I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on the travel day to be super good with carb loading. Obviously, I had beverages and snacks and things that I was going to be taking on the plane. Well, not beverages on the plane, but I knew what I was going to be kind of eating and drinking to an extent. But I also wanted some flexibility with being able to grab lunch at the airport and not have to stress about it. And then, of course, because we were delayed and we were, sitting on the plane for an extra couple of hours for each of the flights that we were on, it was good that I wasn't super stressed about the carb loading. So I started my carb load a day early, had 2 good days, and then a day that I, probably didn't hit my target, but I wasn't tracking or too concerned about it. And then one more day, which was the day before the race. So I felt good about that. I felt like the execution, and I was, very low stress about it the whole time. Which brings me to the night before the race. This is a fun story. So the night before the race, you always want to have a meal that you've eaten the night before a long run or race. Again, though, the key here is that we are not making the meal the night before the focal point of our carb load, or this really important, big, heavy meal, right? Historically, it was the big pasta dinner the night before the race. And of course, you can have pasta. Pasta is a great carb loading food, but I don't want it to be this huge heaping plate of pasta that is so much and you're so full and uncomfortable and it's way more than you would normally eat. And then again, ew, you feel gross the next day, you're too full, you have GI issues, you don't sleep well, all that kind of stuff, right? So pasta is great, but don't feel like you have all comes down to this one big meal the night before your race. And if you are traveling for a race and don't end up being able to have the perfect meal, don't worry about it, right? Don't stress about it. So this is what happened to me the night before my friend Michelle and I ran the New York City Marathon last fall. So we lucked out. We were in the last wave. And so we did not have to even be at our ferry until like 9:30 in the morning. And we were just a very short walk over to the ferry. So we like did not have to be up crazy early, which was fantastic. Most of the time when you're running a marathon, you have to be up at like, the absolute crack of dawn to like be somewhere to get to the start line, whatever. We didn't, which was wonderful. So we booked tickets for the Stranger Things Broadway show for the night before the race. Now, if you are a Stranger Things fan, you absolutely must see this Broadway show. It was amazing. But it was like after 10 o'clock at night, wouldn't tell until like 8 or 9 a.m. So we had lots of time. Like I was not worried about sleep. I knew I was going to sleep crappy the night before the race anyway. So like whatever. Anyway, so we get out of this show and like, hey, well, let's go track down some dinner. Now, mind you, we're not just like trying to go grab some fast food, right? Like, I'm not going to eat McDonald's the night before a marathon, but we can't find like an Italian restaurant. And we're in Times Square, right? But like things are closed. And I was very surprised. Like to me, nothing in New York ever closes down. But yeah, actually a lot of things close in New York City. So we're looking around, we're walking around, and now it's getting to be like 10:30 at night. And we're like, okay, we need to get some food. So we were walking, down the street back to our hotel, kind of thinking we were going to just get back to our hotel and like order pasta, like just order in to be delivered from somewhere because we didn't want to be walking around all night long, right? We're walking and there's a Greek pita place right there. It's open. You know what? Let's just grab a pita. So we did, grabbed a chicken souvlaki pita. It was delicious. Probably had like an iced tea or something with it. I don't remember what I drank. Maybe a juice if they had juice. I'm not sure. But I did the thing that I want you to understand, right? What I want you to remember is that I did a very good job of carb loading up until that point, right? I had had 2 days of good carb loading at home before we traveled. All that day leading up to that point, I had been very mindful of snacking and drinking throughout the day as we were out doing our thing around New York City. So by the time we got to that meal, I didn't know, or it has to be like this specific thing. I just ate what I was going to eat and it was okay. I did not stress or worry about it, right? Because at the end of the day, nothing is going to cause you more problems on race day than unnecessary stress and anxiety. So, as important as it is to execute a good quality carb load and nutrition strategy, not at the expense of your mental health during the race. Because if the whole time you're like, oh my gosh, do I need the bathroom? Oh my gosh, do I need the bathroom? Oh my gosh, I'm going to need the bathroom. Yeah, guess what? You're going to need the bathroom. But if you're like, hey, you know what? It's fine. I've eaten different things the night before a race or the night before a long run. I've trained and kind of rotated through different meals. So I don't only have one thing that I can eat than for an event. That's important too. And in training, I'm the only one in my family training for a marathon, right? My husband, my children are not marathon training. So we're eating all kinds of different things for dinners and the night before I go for my runs. And so the more flexibility with that you can have, I do also think that that's a strength. Again, if you're traveling for races, you have less control over your environment. All right. So that's the night before. Do your best. Obviously, maybe plan a little bit better than I did. I'm not sure. Maybe don't go to a Broadway show until 10 o'clock at night, the night before your marathon. You do live you live your life, and I'll go ahead and make my bad decisions. But that brings us to the morning of, and this is where nothing new on race day, right? We do want to be mindful of nothing new on race day. So while I think that there's a little bit of flexibility and being open to things not going perfectly, the morning of the race is when I probably wouldn't be taking a ton of chances. So you're going to wake up, eat a breakfast that you normally have before a long run. Again, ideally, this is something you have done many, many times in training. The race environment to your long run environment as much as you can, especially if you're like doing something a bit, I'll say strange, like running much later, like for some of these world majors where these later waves are starting quite late in the morning versus when your typical like local race is going to start. If you're running later in the day, like you are running an evening race, some of the like ultra trail events are like overnight. You're starting later in the day. if you are running a Disney event where you're running really early in the morning, right? Like if things are just shifted schedule wise, you want to recreate that in training to the best of your ability so that nothing is a shock to your system or new or weird or whatever. You might have a bigger breakfast than normal if there's going to be quite a few hours between waking up and eating and actually running. So again, for a big event where you need to travel to be at the start line, hours before you actually begin, that's going to be a consideration, right? Now, only, and this is important if you're, again, at a different time of day than maybe you're used to running at, only have caffeine if you're used to it in the morning, right? So don't have a coffee just because it's an early morning. You want to perk yourself up a little bit before the run. If you are not used to having caffeine before a run, today is not the time to try it, right? If you know you want to be able to have a cup of coffee before a run, practice that in training. Be used to having a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it might be before a run. But this is not the time for anything new, especially things that can stimulate the GI tract, right? And so the morning of a small local race versus the morning of like a world major or a Disney event or something like that are going to look really different, right? If you're waking up at home, you're making yourself breakfast, you're traveling down the road to the start line, you're not going far. You don't have to be at the start line any crazy length of time before the race begins. You can kind of get there and drop off your bag and walk up to the start line 5 minutes before the gun goes off, quick warm up, you're good to go. Great. When it's a situation that you have to be somewhere waiting around, a lot more downtime, a lot more like restrictions and rules, obviously it's going to require a different level of planning, and you might have to bring some food with you, bring closer to the time that you're actually going to be running. What you don't want is to eat your breakfast and then you got like 4 hours till you're running and you're starving, right? You're only sort of the race and you're already hungry. It's not ideal. So maybe a bigger breakfast and just like an extra gel before the start line goes off. Maybe you're eating some candy at the New York participants village, runners village, whatever they call it. They're handing out bagels. I ate a whole second bagel before it was time to go, right? Sip on a sports drink, that sort of thing. And then, of course, that's it, right? The gun has gone off and you are ready to race. And so now is the time for implementing your intra-run nutrition strategy, right? So now is when we transition from the start line, the gun goes off, and we're ready to start fueling for during that run, which, of course, you can find all of my podcast episodes talking about intra-run fueling and planning. But today I really want to focus on week nutrition and give you some tips and advice for how to manage the days leading up to make sure that you get to that start line well fueled, well carb loaded, and most importantly, feeling really confident. Because if there's one thing that will serve you well time and time again as a runner, it is your confidence in what you're doing. If you feel ready, if you feel prepared, feel good, that is going to serve you so much better. Even if the plan is not perfect, right? Even if things did not go 100%, even if, you ate something weird the night before and you couldn't find food and none of the restaurants were open, like you were delayed in travel, like whatever happens, right? Even if anything goes wrong, if you feel satisfied and confident and happy about what you're doing, that goes a tremendously long way. All right, so that is it for this week's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it and found it helpful. If you are racing this season and you want some help with your fueling strategy as you prepare for your race, as you get ready for the start line, as you put all these pieces together the weeks of the training, I have a new program, a new nutrition program for runners called the Fueled Runner Program. And so this is an 8-week nutrition focused program where you will walk through putting together all of these pieces, all of these steps from fueling your day-to-day training, regardless of what season you find yourself in, how to fuel before, during, and after your runs for best results in recovery, carb loading, hydration and electrolytes, how to balance training with improving body composition, all of the things that you need to get the understanding of exactly what to eat when for the demands of your training, as well as the confidence that I want you to have in order to execute a fueling plan that you feel really good about. So, once again, that's the Fueled Runner program. You can find more info about that and all of the other ways that we can work together at the link in the show notes. All right, it was super nice chatting with you today, and we will see you back here next week. Bye for now.
On this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.